Underneath the glittering waters of the Mediterranean, there are whispers, fragments of a silence so powerful it echoes across millennia. It was not just a library. It was a vault of human thought, burned not only by flames but by fear. And what was lost inside might still shape our future if only we could remember what we once knew. They called it the greatest library ever built. A beacon of wisdom rising above the bustling port of Alexandria like a temple to knowledge itself. Not just scrolls and books, but the very breath of the ancient world lived within its walls. Imagine walking through its colonnades, the sea breeze carrying the salt of ships arriving from India, Carthage, Athens, all bearing one sacred gift: texts. Words inked onto papyrus, leather, parchment. Each scroll a piece of someone's soul, a civilization's heartbeat transcribed into symbols. Yet the tragedy of the Library of Alexandria is not just its destruction. It is in how little we know about what it truly contained. This was not simply a place for books, it was a laboratory of ideas. A scientific forum. A political archive. A hidden chamber of forbidden texts. Legends say it housed the complete works of Aristotle, entire dynastic records from ancient Egypt, and astronomical models that predicted not just the seasons but time itself. Behind its construction stood ambition beyond comprehension. Ptolemy I, the general of Alexander the Great, wanted Alexandria to outshine every city before it. But it was his successor, Ptolemy II, who pushed the vision further. He wanted all the knowledge of the world in one place. Not metaphorically. Literally. Ships docking at Alexandria were searched and their texts confiscated. Copies were made and the originals kept in the library. The world's knowledge was no longer scattered, it was centralized. Controlled. And that power is what made it both magnificent and dangerous. Inside, philosophers whispered through the night. Herophilus dissected human corpses by candlelight, unlocking the secrets of anatomy 2,000 years ahead of his time. Eratosthenes measured the circumference of the earth using nothing but shadows and logic. There were texts on surgery, astronomy, music, history, mathematics. Names we've forgotten. Languages no longer spoken. Ideas that may have changed the world if only they had survived. But what did survive? And more hauntingly, what didn't? The silence around the destruction of the library is telling. No grand, singular moment of fire as Hollywood would have us believe. No simple villain. Instead, a long, slow erosion. A sequence of misfortunes that chipped away at its walls until nothing remained but the dust of memory. Julius Caesar's siege in 48 BCE is often blamed for the first great fire. His ships, trapped in the Alexandrian harbor, were set ablaze and the flames spread to the docks and nearby buildings. Some say the library's scrolls were caught in that inferno. Others claim only a storage annex was lost. Yet even if only a fraction burned that day, the damage was symbolic. It revealed how fragile such a monument to knowledge truly was. But Alexandria was not done bleeding. Centuries later, the Christian patriarch Theophilus ordered the destruction of pagan temples across Egypt. The Serapeum, one of the satellite buildings of the library, was demolished. Whatever texts had survived Caesar's fire may have perished there under religious fervor deemed heretical. The final blow perhaps came under Caliph Omar in the 7th century, though historians debate this claim. The tale goes that when asked what to do with the remaining scrolls, he said, "If they agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they disagree, they are heresy. Let them burn." This quote may be apocryphal, but the truth is worse because the actual cause of the library's erasure isn't just one villain, but many. Fire. Fanaticism. Neglect. Time. What was lost remains an open wound. Imagine the maps. The unexplored continents sketched by Phoenician sailors. Cures for diseases rediscovered centuries later. Theories of heliocentrism 1,000 years before Copernicus. All trapped in ash. And somewhere, maybe something more. A scroll that challenged the gods. A history that rewrote beginnings. A secret that a ruler thought too dangerous to let live. Some believe the library held the texts of Atlantis. Others, the blueprints for machines powered by wind and steam long before the industrial age. There are whispers of surgical tools, celestial models, and magnetic engines all locked in dusty shelves that no longer exist. Are these myths? Possibly. But if the ancient world could build pyramids with flawless geometry, calendars that still rule our seasons, and calculate the Earth's diameter without ever leaving their homeland, then what else were they capable of? In the second part, we will walk deeper into its corridors, reconstructing, from the shattered echoes, what might have been read under the flickering oil lamps of Alexandria. But the question that haunts every historian remains: if the Library of Alexandria had survived, would we be living in a different world? And if so, who ensured we didn't? The corridors of the library may be gone, but the minds that once walked through them left impressions deeper than stone. When we try to picture the sanctuary of thought, we often imagine dusty scrolls and robed philosophers. But it was far more than that. It was a machine, a living network of scholars, translators, inventors, priests, and spies. Yes, spies. Because knowledge is power, and the Library of Alexandria was the most dangerous repository of that power the world had ever seen. Among its chief architects was Demetrius of Phaleron, an Athenian statesman who had fled political disgrace and found refuge in Alexandria. He brought with him not just knowledge, but the idea that knowledge itself must be collected, categorized, and weaponized. Under his guidance, the library did not simply collect texts, it hunted them. No work was too obscure. No source too remote. Papyrus was copied. Lost dialects translated. Entire cultures stripped for intellectual parts. The library's classification system was revolutionary. The head librarian, Xenodotus, is believed to have pioneered a method of sorting texts by subject, then by author. Later, Callimachus of Cyrene would attempt something even more ambitious, a 120-volume bibliography known as the Pinox, arguably the world's first library catalog. Each entry included a title, author, genre, and a brief summary. It was knowledge about knowledge, an archive of archives. But none of the Pinox survived. We know of them only through second-hand accounts. And it wasn't just Greek knowledge that filled the shelves. The Ptolemies sought out Egyptian papyri, Indian astronomy, Persian medicine, Babylonian mathematics, Jewish philosophy, and more. They commissioned translations into Greek not to preserve other cultures but to control them. One of the most famous of these translations was the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew Torah. 72 scholars, brought together and sequestered, are said to have produced identical translations, word for word, without consultation. Whether myth or miracle, the story reveals what the library had become, a crucible in which worldviews were melted, molded, and recast. And it did not serve only the noble cause of enlightenment. Knowledge is rarely neutral. The Ptolemaic rulers used the library to legitimize their reign. By preserving the texts of conquered peoples, they could claim to be the inheritors not just of territory but of wisdom. The priesthoods of ancient Egypt, once gatekeepers of sacred knowledge, found themselves outmatched by this Greek juggernaut. In public, it was a library. In practice, it was an empire's brain. So who had access? Not the public. This was not a library in the modern sense. It was a closed, guarded place. Entry required permission, purpose, and likely status. The scholars who worked there lived in the Mouseion, a sort of academic monastery where they dined together, studied together, debated together. Funded by the state, these men were free from the burdens of daily survival. But they were not free from politics. Their work reflected the needs of their patrons. Patronage shaped interpretation, curation, and even which texts were deemed worth preserving. Now imagine the knowledge that didn't align with those politics. What happened to it? Was it quietly shelved in a dark corner, never to be copied? Was it destroyed? Or worse, absorbed, reworded, and reattributed, its true origin lost forever? Some scholars of the ancient world believed that the library housed texts that predated the flood described in Mesopotamian and biblical traditions. These antediluvian writings were said to be records of a world before ours. Too dangerous for common eyes. Some say these were hidden in the deepest vaults of the Serapeum or buried beneath the sands when Alexandria fell. Of course, there's no proof. But when a culture builds a temple to memory, what it chooses to forget becomes just as important as what it chooses to remember. There are also rumors of machines. Not the clunky gears of later centuries, but delicate, precise devices lost to time. Hero of Alexandria, a polymath linked to the city's intellectual legacy, described machines that opened temple doors using steam pressure and fountains that flowed without end. His Eolipile, often called the first steam engine, was viewed as a curiosity rather than a revolution. Had his work been preserved and understood, would the industrial age have arrived 1,000 years earlier? We like to think progress is linear. That history is a staircase and each generation stands on the last. But what if we lost entire flights? What if the knowledge burned in Alexandria was not primitive but advanced in ways we no longer comprehend? The scrolls housed there may have contained maps of uncharted lands, astronomical charts more accurate than any European possessed until the Renaissance, and treatises on medicine, psychology, and physics that could rival or even surpass what we now claim as modern. Texts not just on what the world was, but on how it could be shaped. There are whispers that Pythagorean cults, Egyptian high priests, and Eastern mystics all contributed to a body of knowledge now lost. Entire cosmologies. Techniques for memory, meditation, and mind-altering practices we can scarcely reconstruct. Some of these secrets may have been seen as dangerous not because they were false, but because they were too true. The deeper you go into the idea of the library, the more it begins to resemble a myth. But this is not because it was fictional. It's because it became a symbol of what we once reached for and how easily it slipped from our grasp. Like Atlantis, the Library of Alexandria stands as a metaphor for human ambition and its fragility. And perhaps that's why it haunts us. If the library had survived, would the Dark Ages have occurred? Would Galileo have been burned for ideas already inked centuries earlier? Would diseases have been cured before they spread? Would war have been rendered obsolete by better understanding? Or would we simply have found new, more efficient ways to destroy one another? In the next part, we will step into the lives of the people who made the library breathe, the astronomers and physicians, the poets and skeptics, the revolutionaries and visionaries who gave this place its pulse. Because to understand what was lost, we must first understand who it was lost with. They came from all corners of the known world, drawn by the promise of something greater than wealth or power, something far more dangerous, understanding. In the soft morning light, you might have seen them walking slowly beneath the painted columns of the Mouseion, their hands stained with ink, their minds sharp from hours spent in debate, observation, translation, speculation. These were not idle dreamers. They were intellectual architects of an ancient world that was trying to map itself through stars, anatomy, language, and reason. To understand the soul of the Library of Alexandria, you must meet its people. Not just their names, but their minds. Let us begin with Eratosthenes. A polymath, a geographer, a poet, and above all, a thinker ahead of his time. He lived in Alexandria during the 3rd century BCE, and it was within those library walls that he devised something extraordinary, a method to calculate the circumference of the earth using nothing more than a stick, a shadow, and reason. He had heard that in Syene, far to the south, the sun cast no shadow at noon during the summer solstice. But in Alexandria it did. From the angle of that shadow and the known distance between the two cities, Eratosthenes used geometry to estimate the Earth's size. His result? Astonishingly close to modern calculations. While the rest of the world still believed in flat planes or mythic shapes, he had measured a sphere. And where did he find his data? From texts, Babylonian, Egyptian, perhaps even Persian, gathered within that very library. Then there was Herophilus, often called the father of anatomy. He lived in the 4th century BCE and performed dissections, possibly even vivisections, on human bodies, a practice considered deeply taboo in most ancient cultures. But in Alexandria, boundaries were different. The thirst for truth, however disturbing, outweighed sacred silence. Herophilus mapped the human brain and nervous system, correctly identifying the brain, not the heart, as the seat of thought and emotion. He distinguished veins from arteries, described the optic nerve, and recorded the pulse as a diagnostic tool. 2,000 years later, doctors would rediscover what he already knew. These men, and others like them, were not guessing. They were testing, comparing, compiling, and debating using not just observation, but the massive reservoir of texts and experiments stored within the library's vaults. Their conclusions didn't emerge from one culture or language, but from the tapestry of all of them. They were not inventing in isolation, they were standing on every available shoulder, reaching for the next rung of possibility. Another name, Aristarchus of Samos. Before Copernicus. Before Galileo. It was Aristarchus who first proposed that the Earth orbited the Sun. He did it in Alexandria using geometry and logic, and likely drew from Babylonian star charts and Egyptian records of solstices. His ideas were revolutionary and they were dismissed. The Earth-centered cosmos remained dominant for centuries more until his lost arguments were echoed in Renaissance Europe. Imagine if his model had been preserved, taught, spread. How many generations of science were delayed simply because the right scrolls turned to ash? And not all were scientists. The library attracted poets, linguists, philosophers like Apollonius of Rhodes, whose Argonautica attempted to bring Homeric epic into a more rational, humanized form. There were mythographers who tried to reconcile conflicting creation stories, grammarians who debated the pronunciation of archaic Greek vowels, even comic playwrights whose satirical scrolls mocked kings and scholars alike. It was a city of minds, a community where someone could spend a decade studying just the etymology of a single word or constructing a globe based on star positions gathered from travelers. Alexandria wasn't just collecting scrolls, it was collecting perspectives. The scholars worked in tandem, not alone. Ideas passed between them, challenged each other, evolved. A mathematician might visit an astronomer to verify a curve observed in the stars, then consult a physician about the rhythm of the human pulse and find parallels in nature. This interconnectedness was the library's greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability, because it made the knowledge indivisible. Fragile. Like a spiderweb, touch one thread and the entire structure shudders. And the threads began to weaken. As time went on, the purity of the vision began to dilute. Political unrest, foreign invasions, economic shifts, and religious upheavals slowly eroded the resources and freedom once granted to the Mausian scholars. As rulers changed, so too did their priorities. Some saw the library as a drain on the treasury. Others feared what was written in those scrolls. Heresies, contradictions, dangerous knowledge. By the time of the Roman Empire, many of the great minds had vanished. Some left, others died, and some were silenced. And the scrolls? They decayed, crumbled, or were quietly removed. What once buzzed with debate fell silent. But the question remains, were the most powerful texts ever even shown to the public? Whispers tell of secret rooms, subterranean chambers beneath the Serapeum where the most volatile knowledge was stored. Texts on forbidden sciences, dark rituals, and pre-human history. Whether these were real or the projections of later imaginations, the allure remains. If knowledge is power and absolute knowledge is absolute power, then perhaps some scrolls were too dangerous to read, let alone copy. It is possible that even in its prime, the library did not give away its deepest secrets lightly. Access may have been limited not only by rank but by trust, allegiance, even bloodline. There may have been codes, riddles, initiations. We will never know. But the idea that there existed a level of knowledge beyond the reach of all but a chosen few persists across cultures and eras. From the burning of Baghdad's House of Wisdom to the Nazi looting of European archives, the story of Alexandria repeats itself. And always we are left wondering, what was in the books we never read? The next part of this story will take us away from the scholars and deeper into the slow-motion destruction of the library, not just its physical destruction, but its erasure from collective memory. Because what is lost in fire can still be remembered, but what is erased from history vanishes forever. They called it the mind of the ancient world, but no mind is immune to silence. As the centuries passed, Alexandria changed. The intellectual heartbeat that once echoed through its stone halls began to slow. The scholars who had once debated under oil lamps were gone, their voices replaced by the shuffle of soldiers and the whisper of politics. The library, once protected by kings and prized above gold, became vulnerable. Not in one sudden moment, but over generations of erosion, neglect, and fear. By the time the Roman Empire tightened its grip on Egypt, Alexandria was no longer the bright flame it had once been. Rome admired Greek knowledge, yes, but did not worship it. The emperors sent officials, not philosophers. Governors, not mathematicians. The fire of curiosity that had once demanded scrolls from every ship now flickered behind layers of bureaucracy and shifting political winds. The Mausian lost funding. Scholars left. Some were absorbed into Roman institutions. Others simply vanished. A city built on the pursuit of truth slowly began to value power more than insight. There is no single date, no defining explosion, no simple villain to blame. The destruction of the library was not an event, it was a process. Julius Caesar's campaign in Alexandria is often remembered as the first major blow. In 48 BCE, while trying to secure the city during a civil war between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII, Caesar set fire to his own ships in the harbor to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The flames spread. Ancient accounts conflict on whether the library itself was destroyed or merely a nearby warehouse of scrolls. Some say 40,000 scrolls were lost. Others claim far more. But all sources agree on one thing: something burned. Something important. And no one ever replaced it. Even if only a portion of the collection was lost, it was a wound that never healed. And the deeper damage came not from fire, but from what followed. The Roman period turned the library into something quieter, more domesticated. The ferocious ambition of Ptolemy's vision was gone. The demand to collect, challenge, and transform knowledge muted. Scrolls continued to decay. The scholars who once restored, copied, and questioned them no longer had the means or the support. The Serapeum, a secondary library and temple devoted to Serapis, became increasingly important as the main Mouseion faded. For a time it held on to fragments of that ancient glory. But the world was changing. Christianity was rising. And with it came a new tension between faith and philosophy. By the 4th century CE, that tension turned into violence. Theophilus, Patriarch of Alexandria, led a campaign against pagan temples. What once had been revered as a monument to divine knowledge was now seen as heretical. The Serapeum was attacked and destroyed in 391 CE. Statues were smashed. Altars desecrated. Scrolls, if any, remained burned or scattered. The very idea of collecting rival truths in one place had become dangerous. The library, even in fragments, was a threat to order. And yet, knowledge did not surrender easily. A philosopher named Hypatia, born in the late 4th century, stood as one of the final lights of Alexandria's intellectual tradition. She taught mathematics, astronomy, and Neoplatonic philosophy. She wrote commentaries on the works of Apollonius and Diophantus, and she preserved methods of logical thinking long after their originators were forgotten. She was respected by many, feared by others. In 415 CE, she was murdered by a Christian mob. They dragged her from her chariot, stripped her, flayed her alive with shards of pottery, and burned her remains. Not for a crime, but for being a symbol. A woman. A pagan. A thinker. With her death, the last living link to the golden age of the library was severed. What followed was not fire, but forgetting. The city that once stored the thoughts of 1,000 cultures now whispered prayers in Latin and Greek. The scrolls that hadn't already decayed were destroyed through neglect. Ink fades. Papyrus crumbles. And without the hands of scribes, even the greatest words dissolve into silence. Some historians point to the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century as the final end. A story persists, though debated, that when the conqueror Amr ibn al-As asked what to do with the remaining scrolls, Caliph Omar replied, "If the books agree with the Quran, we do not need them. If they disagree, they are dangerous. Burn them." Whether true or invented later, the symbolism is clear. Knowledge, once sacred, was now conditional. The tragedy is not just what was destroyed, it's what was not copied. For centuries, the library gathered rare works from Persia, India, Assyria, Africa, and beyond. Many existed in only one copy. When they were lost, there was no backup. No second shelf in some distant temple. That knowledge did not move forward into new civilizations, it simply stopped. Entire schools of thought may have died that way. Medicine based on herbs now extinct. Star charts that mapped celestial movements now forgotten. Mathematical systems erased not because they were wrong, but because they were buried with the people who understood them. Language, too, was a victim. Dialects faded. Grammar lost. Meaning dissolved. The scrolls didn't just hold facts. They held context. Without that, even the rediscovered fragments found centuries later became puzzles with missing pieces. Misinterpreted, misattributed, or simply ignored. And in the silence left behind, humanity imagined monsters. The library became legend, a symbol of arrogance or utopia or forbidden knowledge, a warning about ambition or a whisper of a better world that could have been. People filled the void with stories that it contained books from Atlantis, maps of the stars made by gods, machines powered by thought. In the absence of truth, imagination took over. And that is what remains. Even today, we don't know what we lost. We can only guess. And in every guess, there is a shadow. Not just of what once was, but of who we could have been. Imagine standing in a vast chamber lit only by flickering oil lamps, the scent of ink, wax, and old papyrus thick in the air. Shelves tower around you, wooden scaffolds reaching toward the ceiling, each one filled with scrolls meticulously labeled in multiple languages. Some of these works exist nowhere else in the world. Their authors are unknown to time, their ideas untested, their discoveries unimaginable. And they're all about to vanish, not in a blaze of glory, but in the soft, slow breath of rot and neglect. This is the true tragedy of the Library of Alexandria. It wasn't merely destroyed. It was forgotten. The burning ships, the fanatical mobs, the invading armies, they were just the final blows. The real death of the library came long before, when the passion for collecting, copying, and protecting knowledge dimmed. When scrolls were left to decay. When scribes became soldiers. When ideas no longer sparked action. But here's what makes this story even more haunting. Though the library itself was lost, fragments of its knowledge somehow survived. Not as books, not as buildings, but as echoes in later civilizations. Islamic scholars in Baghdad's House of Wisdom would later study Greek texts painstakingly translated from the ruins of Alexandria's holdings. Medieval Europe, through Arabic intermediaries, would rediscover Aristotle and Galen and Ptolemy, all filtered through a lens that might trace back to a single Alexandrian scroll rescued before it crumbled. And in some cases, a single line from an ancient work quoted by a later author would be all that survived. Just a sentence. Just a phrase. And from that ghost, historians would try to reconstruct a lost universe. It's as if we were given a single bone and asked to rebuild the dinosaur. One such example is the case of Archimedes. Though he lived in Syracuse, not Alexandria, there's strong reason to believe that Alexandrian scholars preserved and studied his works. Centuries later, a palimpsest, a parchment manuscript overwritten with religious text, was found containing lost treatises of Archimedes hidden beneath prayers. The only reason it survived was because a monk had scraped the pages and reused them. Imagine how many more scrolls were recycled, burned for heat, shredded for packaging, or buried with their owners. Imagine what didn't survive. But perhaps the most extraordinary mystery surrounding the library is not what was lost, but what it might have contained that we still haven't imagined. What if it held blueprints for machines never built? Maps of continents yet to be discovered? What if a single text in that library had the potential to change the course of human history? Many believe it did. Some scholars speculate that the library housed ancient Indian treatises on medicine and surgery that far exceeded contemporary Western knowledge. Others claim that Chinese records brought through trade routes were stored there, containing early understanding of magnetism, metallurgy, or paper production. There's even the controversial idea that the library held scrolls from civilizations predating Sumer, possibly even remnants of oral traditions from lost coastal cultures swallowed by rising seas. We may never know if those claims are true. But the very fact that we can't know because the evidence is gone is a tragedy unto itself. The absence of knowledge is not just a blank page. It's a prison. It locks humanity into repeating mistakes, reinventing discoveries, and fearing what it doesn't understand. The thinkers of Alexandria weren't just collecting scrolls, they were mapping humanity's potential. By assembling knowledge from Africa, Persia, India, Greece, and beyond, they were building a mirror that showed what we could become if we chose to think collectively rather than tribally. And that vision terrified many. A world where gods could be questioned, where stars had patterns, where illness had causes, where power rested not in swords or temples but in minds, was a threat to every structure built on obedience and fear. The library's destruction, then, wasn't just an accident of war or time. It was, in many ways, deliberate. A slow strangulation of curiosity. A war against nuance. An erasure of complexity in favor of simple truths and controlled narratives. And we feel its absence even now. How many of our scientific revolutions were really just rediscoveries? How many wars might have been avoided had cultures preserved their shared texts? How many cures remained hidden because the knowledge was lost, forgotten, or feared? The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a place. It was a promise. A promise that if humanity could gather its wisdom, listen to its past, and collaborate across its differences, then anything was possible. But promises can be broken. What we inherit now are shadows of that dream. Pages torn from a book we can no longer read. Still, some embers remain. And that's where hope lives. Perhaps the most astonishing legacy of the Library of Alexandria is not in what it preserved, but in what it dared to attempt. It wasn't just a storehouse. It was a statement that all human knowledge, regardless of language, land, or God, could live together under one roof. That ideas, however dangerous or foreign, deserve to be tested, not destroyed. And that the human mind, given enough time and freedom, could unlock the secrets of the universe. Even today, in an age of satellites and artificial intelligence, we haven't matched the ambition of that dream. We have the technology, yes. We have more data than the ancient world could imagine. But we've never again built a single institution with that same audacity, to collect everything, question everything, and invite the entire known world to participate. And perhaps that's why the library continues to haunt us, not just as a place, but as a possibility. Imagine what our world might look like if it had survived. If the scrolls had been preserved, translated, shared. If Herophilus' anatomical discoveries had influenced European medicine 1,000 years earlier. If Aristarchus' heliocentric model had been accepted in ancient Rome. If philosophies from India and Africa had been integrated into Western thought in real time rather than centuries late. How much faster would we have progressed? How many lives saved? How many mistakes never made? There is a quiet grief in knowing that the past once held such a flame and that we let it die. But from that grief, something powerful can emerge, responsibility. Because while the ancient library is gone, the idea is not. Today, in archives, universities, databases, and even this very moment, knowledge is still being gathered, still being protected, still being debated. The dream of Alexandria flickers in every translated manuscript, every digitized codex, every conversation across borders. The difference now is that the responsibility no longer belongs to kings or priests or scholars alone. It belongs to everyone. To preserve knowledge, to question it, to share it, to protect it not just from fire, but from indifference, from distortion, from those who would silence it. The Library of Alexandria fell not just because it was burned, but because too many people stopped fighting for what it stood for. Let that never happen again. If there's a lesson in the ashes, it's this: knowledge is fragile, but its pursuit is sacred. And when we lose sight of that, we lose more than just books. We lose who we might have become. So if there's any way to honor what was lost in Alexandria, it's not just to mourn it. It's to rebuild it, piece by piece, word by word, together. Never stop asking, never stop seeking, and never ever let the light go out.